the noise that alerts me that people are entering the chat has slowed. So hopefully we're all here now. We can oh, there's another one. We can we can get started. Oh, I say that. There's lots more noises. Maybe just one more minute. Okay, that'll do. Let's go for it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the call today. So my name is Zanthe. Some of you might know, I see a few familiar names in the call today. So my name's Zanthe. I'm an associate employment lawyer with Neathouse Partners. I've been here for a good few years. I've qualified as an employment lawyer 5 years ago, but I've been in the business for nearly a decade. And most of my work includes speaking to lots of you every day and going through your queries. I sometimes do a little bit of consultancy work and I do litigation as well, sort of cover the lot of it. But today, of course, we are here to talk about the legal changes that are coming into effect very soon in April 2026 with regards to redundancy processes. So I'm going to walk you through some of the really important developments that are happening in UK employment law today and how those will affect how organisations plan and carry out redundancies. Now, even if redundancy isn't something that you tend to deal with every day, and most people don't, especially collective consultation redundancy on quite a large scale, but even if it isn't something you deal with very frequently, these changes do significantly increase the risks for employers who get the process wrong, particularly with relation to collective consultation. And of course, it's really important to stay up to date. So I'm going to cover what the law says right now, and then we'll move on to what's changing and how those risks can impact you as business owners and HR professionals, and hopefully make sure that you don't sort of fall into any of the pitfalls. So the session's likely to take around 40 minutes, and then I'll take questions at the end. I think Saul's popped a message in the chat. Feel free to put questions in the chat if you like, but it might just be best if you save them to the end. We see it quite often that you'll ask a question and then in the next slide I'll answer it. So if you can keep them till the end, that might be best. Now the session's being recorded, so if you would like to refer back to it, it should be on YouTube quite shortly after today on the Neathouse Partners YouTube page. So without further ado, let's dive in. Now, as I said, you might not have encountered redundancy particularly frequently, especially collective consultation, but it is a really important area that can lead to lots of liability, quite significant sums of liability. So we're going to go over the key developments for employers under the Employment Rights Act 2025, and that is the piece of legislation effectively that has caused these changes. So what we're covering today can feel quite technical, but it does come up more often than people expect, particularly with restructures and companies launching things like cost-saving exercises, and then they reorganize some of the business structure. It doesn't always feel or sound like a redundancy, but quite often those rules will apply. Something that I'll sort of stress throughout, but want to make clear right now, is that most tribunal claims, so penalties that employers pay at the end of these kinds of processes, they don't arise because the redundancy itself, the reason behind the redundancy, the business case, is wrong or incorrect or insufficient. They arise because process wasn't followed, and we see this really quite frequently. So that's something to bear in mind. Just because you are confident in the fact that you have a strong business case, and it's really easy to show that there's a loss of or a loss of business which leads to a reduction in requirement for certain roles. That doesn't mean that you don't need to follow the process, and that's where employers tend to go wrong. So hopefully today will help you avoid those kinds of issues. Now, these reforms, as I said, they came from the Employment Rights Act 2025, which was part of the government's Make Work Pay programme. Now, as you may know, this was the UK government's quite comprehensive initiative to overhaul employment law, effectively changing lots of different things. And this was aimed at boosting wages and improving job security and generally just modernising workers' rights. So central to that plan was the Employment Rights Act 2025, which received royal assent late last year, and introduces probably the biggest sort of upgrade to workers' rights in quite some time. Now, the programme introduces several major changes, many of which are being phased in between 2026 and 27. I'm sure you've heard of lots of the changes that are coming in. We're seeing changes to day one rights, quite an overhaul to SSP, statutory sick pay, and 0 hours contracts. Lots of changes are coming in. Some have already or are coming in really soon. Now, these redundancy related provisions that we're going to be discussing are coming in, as we said, in April 2026. It's not actually the 1st of April. They're coming in next Monday, the 6th of April, presumably because it's a Monday, even though it's bank holiday. So, as I said, the focus today will be on those redundancy changes. Mostly we'll be talking about redundancy planning and collective consultation. Now, what is the current position? So, obviously before April 2026. It's obviously really important to understand the current legal framework so that we can gather what is changing. Now, at the moment, employers are required to collectively consult when they are proposing 20 or more redundancies at a single establishment within a 90-day period. So this does include employees who have less than 2-year service. This consultation requirement, that's something that employers often forget or think they can sort of get around, but there is still risk with that. Now, an establishment in this context means a specific workplace or site. So, for example, a particular office, if there is a chain of offices, or a particular store, or a certain workhouse even. So redundancy situations are effectively confined to those spaces in this context. Now, if that threshold is met, so 20 or more redundancies at one establishment in 90 days, then the employer must consult collectively. Now, that means they have to consult with either a recognised trade union, if there is one present, or if not, they need to consult with an elected employee representative. Now, there are also minimum consultation periods. If you are looking at making between 20 and 99 redundancies, you need to consult for a minimum of 30 days. And if there will be 100 or more redundancies, we're looking at a minimum of 45 days. Now, of course, the specific process that's followed is effectively changeable, and I would, of course, recommend that you get tailored legal advice if you find yourself in this kind of situation. But as I said, importantly, if an employer fails to comply with these obligations, as I set out here, then an employment tribunal can award what's called a protective award, and this can go to up to 90 days pay per affected employee. So that's the baseline position. That's what we're dealing with now. But this is effectively what's going to be changing. So if we just build on the phrase, proposing redundancies is really important and is something that I flag quite frequently. This duty to consult doesn't arise, obviously when decisions about redundancies are finalised, it arises when redundancies are still in proposed stages. As I said, I see this quite often with clients that the outcome is effectively prejudged to some extent. They'll come to me and they'll say, we want to make these people redundant, and they tend to be quite sort of specific. And whilst commercially, that's not unrealistic, the fact that there'll be some people who are likely to be more targeted, but technically that does mean that some of the outcome is prejudged. So that technically is not what we should be doing. We should be consulting really early on in the process, so that it can be a collaborative process effectively. Consultation needs to happen early enough for it to genuinely influence outcome. Now, there's a well-known case called UK coal mining versus National Union of Mine Workers, which really honed in on this. It emphasized that consultation needs to be meaningful. You've possibly heard that term around. And what does that mean? So consultation needs to be meaningful. It can't just be a tick box exercise. So if an employer, as I said, has already decided exactly who's going to go, when, and then starts consultation, that's likely to be too late. And if there are points that infer that, because of course, hopefully you wouldn't be silly enough to sort of dive in and say all of that. But if there's a connotation of that, then that can lead to risk as well. Another point to highlight, of course, is what consultation must actually cover. So as I said, it's dependent on the situation, but employers are required to consult on ways of avoiding dismissals, reducing the number of dismissals, and ways of potentially mitigating the consequences. So again, these are fairly vague terms, and how those things need to look isn't set in stone. It's quite a flexible process. But it's sort of honing in on the fact that redundancy processes aren't just about informing employees, letting them know this is what's going to happen and this is when, but it's about really engaging with them. And quite often I'll say to employers, I know you have an idea of what you'd like to do, but of course you need to consult on possible ways of avoiding dismissals. And employees are quite often a useful source of ideas because they know the business, and they know their roles, and they usually understand the structure quite well, so they can come up with solutions that you've maybe not considered yourselves. Things that they might suggest that you didn't think they might be open to. For example, voluntary redundancy instead of a compulsory process can be really useful because it reduces the requirements to do all of these things. And we quite often will advise that as part of a voluntary redundancy, you get things in writing. You maybe look at a settlement agreement, or compromise agreements, they used to be called that, so that you have legal protection, but it effectively avoids the requirement for you to go through this whole process. Um, Employees can also, they might suggest taking on reduced hours, and that might not be something that you've initially thought of or thought that they might be keen on. Things like redeployments, that's also something that employees might volunteer as an option. Now, as I said, if those options aren't genuinely considered, it can create legal risk, which is what we'll be moving on to next. So, an overview of the changes that are coming in from next Monday. Now, there are 4 key developments that we're going to focus on today, some more than others. The first point is the protective award. So what I mentioned earlier, the 90 days pay. So that's the financial penalty, as I said, for failing to consult. That financial penalty is being doubled. So that's quite daunting. Secondly, tribunals will have stronger powers to effectively increase compensation, even more so where employers fail to follow the proper procedures. And third, the collective consultation framework itself is being expanded. So I'll touch a bit more on what that means, but it's most likely going to be affecting employers that have multiple sites. Now, finally, there are new protections for certain workers in the maritime section. Now, that's something that I'm not going to be covering too much because it is quite niche, but I thought I'd mention it for completeness, and it is quite relevant when we talk about some more of the background as to why these changes have been brought in. Now, taken together, these changes, as I'm sure is clear, are designed to make employers take consultation much more seriously, and to close some perceived gaps in the current law. Now, as I said, these reforms didn't come out of nowhere, and they're still being discussed. There are still changes that are coming that we aren't clear on. They're partly a response to criticism that UK redundancy law effectively wasn't protective enough, wasn't protecting employees sufficiently, particularly in large-scale redundancies and restructures. There have been some high-profile cases where employers have been seen to have avoided consultation obligations, which has clearly driven a bit of a political momentum for change. We'll touch on that a bit more later. You might all know the case I'm going to be mentioning. It was it was quite the case. But effectively, the direction of travel here is clear. We're looking for greater protection for employees and greater accountability for employers. So let's start with the protective award, because this is probably the most immediate and the most impactful change. Now, as I said, currently, if an employer fails to properly carry out collective consultation, the tribunal can award up to 90 days pay per employee. So from next Monday, that maximum is going to increase to 180 days per employee, which is obviously very, very significant. Now, it's important to understand that the tribunal doesn't treat this as compensation for financial loss of employment. It is effectively a penalty, a telling off for the employer for failing to consult properly. Now, naturally, other awards can also be made alongside this award. If a claim for, unfair dismissal is brought, for example, then an employer could be facing what we call a basic award and a compensatory award, and then potentially this on top. Now, tribunals will generally avoid what's called double recovery, double enrichment, which means the claimant, the former employee or employee, is being given twice the amount for the same thing, which they'll try to avoid. But the point is that you could, of course, be on the hook for quite a substantial amount. Something else really significant is that there's no statutory cap on what we call a week's pay for the purposes of this protective award, which means that amounts can just be incredibly substantial, specifically for higher earners. Now, when I talk about the weekly cap, what I mean is you might be familiar with it if you've ever gone through redundancy processes, and if you've had to calculate statutory redundancy payments. So if you've ever done the calculation, you know that there is a cap for weekly pay. So if you have a really high earner, who's earning £2,000 a week, that figure will actually be capped. So the year we're currently in, the cap is £719 per year. That's going to go up a bit. It does every year. That'll go up next Monday, April the 6th, to £751 per week. But what it effectively means is when you're calculating your statutory redundancy payment, it can only ever go so high. But that cap does not exist when we talk about this protective award. So if someone is earning massive amounts of money per week, you're paying 180 times that for the maximum award. Now, the maximum award is a maximum. Tribunals do retain discretion on how high up the scale they go. But if consultation is entirely absent, then they are very likely to just award the maximum. And that is something that we tend to see. We unfortunately tend to quite frequently see that employers will either do a reasonable job of running through a process, or they will simply do nothing. And so you do quite often see the maximum award being given out. Now, as I said, it's important that we understand how tribunals decide the level of this protective award. And as I said, the key principle is that it is punitive. They're here to teach you a lesson. So it does directly correlate with how poorly the process that was followed was. There was a case called Susie Radin Limited versus GMB, and that was it was a clothing factory that made over 100 employees redundant, sort of at the drop of a hat. Didn't follow any process, and that case actually was the precedent to make it clear that the purpose of this award is to punish the employer for failing to consult, not to compensate employees for financial loss. So that's why tribunals tend quite often to award the maximum when there's been no consultation at all. And of course, doubling the maximum from 90 days pay to 180 days pay is a very deliberate move to increase that punitive effect. And of course, in reality, that means that employers can no longer really treat consultation as something optional or low risk. All that, of course, is what the government is aiming to achieve. Now, the practical impact of the increased protective award, a bit of maths to scare you further. If we just look at an example, so at the moment, say you have 50 employees that are being made redundant and you're not consulting properly. Now, obviously, if that were to happen right now, or if that was something that you'd done in the past and it was sort of going through tribunal now, you would be looking at the first set of figures. So apparently the average UK employee earns about £140 a day. That's quite interesting to to Google. So that's approximately £35,000 per annum. Now, of course, bear in mind that that's a big spectrum of employees. Um, but for one employee at £140 a day, you would be looking, in this instance, if they're awarding 90 days pay, at £12,600 each. So if you have 50 affected employees, you're looking at £630,000. Now, that's not really what you're looking at anymore. That's what you would have been looking at. Now we're looking at double that. So the potential exposure here, as you can see, 50 employees with 180 days pay at £140 a day, we're looking at £1,260,000. So well over £1 million. And as I said, this isn't the only award that could be awarded if a large claim is brought, and if an employee succeeds in that claim. So you can see effectively how quickly the financial exposure is increasing here. And for organisations making large-scale redundancies, these awards could, as we see, amount to hundreds of thousands, even £1 million. So it's really important to get the process right. Now, moving on to the next major change. This is still quite a vague one, that's still being discussed, but it's something that's definitely going to happen. So it's certainly worth mentioning. The expansion of the collective consultation organisation-wide trigger that we were talking about. So as I said, under the current rules, we are talking about a 20 employee threshold, and that applies to redundancies at a single establishment. As I said, a single office or store, warehouse, or workshop. However, the government is introducing an additional trigger that looks at redundancies across an entire organisation. So now you won't just be able to treat sites as independent. You won't be able to look at them in isolation. So if redundancies are happening across multiple locations, it is likely that those are going to need to be aggregated. So as I said, the exact details, including the numerical threshold, the exact number that's going to apply, are going to be set out further in probably secondary regulations that are coming. But the key point is that the scope is widening and it could happen quite quickly. We're not sure when. Of course, one of the biggest practical challenges here will probably be the coordination of everything, because in larger organizations, redundancy decisions are often made at a departmental or regional level, but this change will require much more of a centralized view. So HR teams will need to be really engaged, and they'll effectively need to ask, what else is happening in the business, potentially in a branch of the business, in a different store or workshop that, that I have very little to do with. What's happening? Are there parallel restructures taking place? And could all of these trigger the collective consultation obligation that I need to adhere to? So it's really important to communicate, and we do see quite often that larger companies sometimes struggle with this. I expect that we'll see future tribunal cases effectively testing the waters, testing what organizational wide actually means, in practice, particularly in complex corporate structures with things like subsidiaries or, group companies. How it will work will be interesting to see, but it is suddenly coming. So this change really was aimed at closing what's often been described as a bit of a loophole in the law, that quite a lot of companies have been known to exploit. So at the moment, an employer could just avoid the collective consultation requirements by making smaller numbers of redundancies across different sites, and isolating those. So for example, making 10 redundancies at 4 different locations, but that wouldn't trigger then the collective consultation requirements because each individual site is below the threshold of 20 redundancies. But in reality, it's 40 redundancies overall. So this new approach is designed effectively to capture those types of situations and making sure trying to make sure that employees still benefit from their consultation rights. So as I said, for HR teams, this means that you'll need a much more sort of joined up and organizational wide view of the redundancy planning, which can be quite difficult, especially if it's a large company or if it's quite fragmented. Now, this issue kind of links back to a case called USDAW versus Woolworths, and they looked at the definition of, establishment, as in different establishments, those triggers don't apply. And the outcome of that case meant that, as I said, individual stores could be treated as separate establishments, which really limited the scope of this collective consultation. But this reform effectively overhauls that case, and says that that's no longer active precedent. That's not what we're doing anymore. So, important takeaway: if you've historically relied on more of a site-by-site analysis and treated, independent stores independently, then you can't be doing that anymore. This eliminates that. Now, the tribunal penalty uplifts by 25%. So another important change is the introduction of the potential tribunal uplift to 25%. So what this says is that employment tribunals may increase awards up to 25% where an employer either unreasonably fails to follow the required procedures or breaches the applicable statutory codes. Now, this is particularly important where employers fail to follow, as we're saying, the consultation process, all the codes of practice, which we'll sort of be moving on to in a moment. This is quite similar to how the ACAS code works when it comes to unfair dismissal. So that's the ACAS code with regards to process when someone is dismissed. So, for example, you're attempting to dismiss someone for poor conduct. The ACAS code sets out the structure that you need to follow when you're doing that. You need to invite them to a proper hearing. You need to give them the chance to be accompanied and the opportunity to appeal. Blah blah blah. If you don't follow those, then awards can be increased by up to 25%. So not only are the base penalties increasing that we've just discussed, but there's a potential for an additional financial consequence on top of that. Now, again, this clearly reinforces the importance of following the correct process and makes it clear what the government's trying to do by changing all of these things. So the code of conduct that I mentioned in the last slide, a lot of that, and this is certainly worth mentioning, therefore, these changes interact with what is quite often called fire and rehire tactics. Now, as the name suggests, this is where employers dismiss employees and then they will offer re-engagement on new terms that suit them better. So this is seen quite frequently. And because of that, a statutory code, a code of practice, was brought in this area. And if employers fail to follow it, and an employee does bring a claim and is successful in that claim, a tribunal can apply a 25% uplift like the one that we just mentioned. And we do really see this quite often. Now, this here is particularly relevant because sometimes redundancy processes are used as part of a wider restructure exercise that involves changes to terms and conditions. Sometimes even when I'll first speak to a client about a plan that they have with regards to a restructure, it isn't even clear really from the first instance whether we're talking about a restructure and a change to terms and conditions or a redundancy. So there's a lot of overlap here, and HR teams need to be mindful of both sets of rules applying when they plan these kinds of things. So, for example, imagine that an employer wants to change working hours or pay structure. Instead of negotiating changes, they can sometimes label roles as redundant. They'll just say, oh, we don't need your role anymore. And then they get rid of those employees, and then they can potentially rehire them or others on new terms that suit them better. So in reality, that's a restructure, but it's covered up as a redundancy. Now, tribunals, as I said, they're increasingly alert to this kind of situation. Because if a redundancy isn't genuine, if there isn't a genuine reduction of work of a certain type, and if consultation isn't properly carried out, hopefully during those consultations, employees will be made aware of the situation and they'll think things through and they'll think, hold on, this isn't actually redundancy. If employers sort of try to pull that tactic, they can face multiple claims. So, we're talking not only unfair dismissal, but this protective award, this scary protective award, and then uplifts under the code. Now, I'll just briefly touch on something that I mentioned quickly, and that's sort of a fourth big change that's coming in, but it's really sector specific. It's about maritime workers. Um, I'll just touch on this very lightly because it helps paint the overall picture, but I'm conscious how niche it is and it probably won't apply. But the law is effectively being extended to provide stronger redundancy protection for workers on ships that operate out of UK ports, even if those ships are registered overseas. And this is effectively, in the spirit of everything that we've discussed, it's intended to prevent employers from avoiding UK employment protections by using foreign registrations. As I said, I'm conscious this doesn't affect many organisations, but it's an important development about what's going on effectively, which, as we know, is to broaden the scope of employment protections. So, stepping back, what are the key risks for employers? As I said, the first one is the financial risk here, which is really quite serious. The protective award has been doubled. Then we've got the scope risk secondarily, because the rules may now apply to across the organization as opposed to individual size. As I said, that hasn't specifically come in yet, but it could come in very quickly. And third, the procedural risk, because tribunals can now increase awards if correct processes aren't followed. Now, in practice, most, as I said, claims arise not because redundancy wasn't justified, but because the process wasn't handled properly. And that's where HR plays a really crucial role. The biggest practical risk is procedural mistake rather than a substantive redundancy justification. And we see this really very frequently. Lots of employers have a foundational right to start redundancies in the sense that they have a good backup, reasonable business case. But they think that because of that, they don't need to follow proper process. It's not important to tick all of the boxes, which is wrong. We really often see this with disciplinary processes too. I'll have a client call me up and say that they had an employee commit quite clear gross misconduct, do something violent or illegal. But they have over 2 years service, and then they'll tell me that they fired them on the spot, and that's the worst thing that you could have done, because it means that you haven't followed process at all. So automatically, if they make a claim, you're on the hook for it. And that's quite similar to what we're seeing here. Another thing that I would stress is the reputational risk of not handling redundancies properly. Some of the biggest cases in this area don't just involve the legal liability, but they can attract quite significant media attention and union involvement, real employment relations issues. So to get this kind of thing wrong can have consequences beyond just employment tribunal claims and high costs. As you all know, probably, because it was all over the news, in March 2022, P&O ferries were splashed across front pages because they made the decision to make 786 staff members redundant without any consultation, all at the same time, and then replace them with much cheaper agency workers they said it was to prevent company collapse. So again, a probably reasonable foundation to the redundancy, but the process obviously not great. Employees were notified in a 3-minute video message, which you might have seen online. I saw it a good few times. Of course, it was hot news in the employment sphere. But they were just unceremoniously told what was going on, and that was that. Now, of course, this prompted major protests and legal challenges over failure to follow the UK consultation laws. And despite the lack of notice, P&O clearly had some kind of weird backup plan, but they ended up paying £47 million in compensation. They effectively offered settlement agreements which exceeded the minimum statutory requirements to avoid the legal action. So clearly what they were doing was just, they really didn't want to go through the process of consulting, and fair enough, it seems like there were lots of employees affected, but instead of that, they obviously clearly went through quite a lot of administrative effort to issue settlement agreements to all of these employees and get those things signed off. But there were, obviously there were legal consequences. The former CEO acknowledged that they effectively broke the laws regarding consultation, which led to lots of investigations and really quite intense political pressure on the firm. Now, in the end, the crew was replaced with workers from international locations at significantly lower hourly rates, and the impact led to a public outcry, massive protests, and action by unions, and arguably now lasting changes to how these things work. And it led to loads of debates around employment rights. And I think that the fourth change that I mentioned, that I touched on about maritime workers and their rights, it probably literally led to this. So yes, don't think that you can do outrageous things and totally get away with it. Well, clearly you can't if you're P&O. Now, what should employees be doing now? So first, you should be reviewing and updating your redundancy policies and procedures because the rules are changing. Secondary, you need to make sure that you have systems in place to track redundancy proposals across the organization. So I'd really recommend that you just have something in place, some kind of, base touching with HR, heads of HR, especially if things are quite fragmented in your company. Third, you need to be training your HR teams and your managers so that they understand the requirements and they know these red flags. Hopefully you're all here and that's what we're doing now. Hopefully you're still engaged and I haven't lost you. um, then it's also really helpful, can be really helpful to ensure that you have employee representative structures in place. um, and make sure that you have some kind of structure ready to go. And this is useful not just for redundancies, any kind of consultation requirements. It can be really helpful. And if you have that structure in place, then you won't need to suddenly elect representatives, which can really delay processes. So that's good to bear in mind, maybe have to think about. And finally, as I will always stress, take legal advice early. If you're thinking of restructuring, especially if you're doing large, complex restructures, early planning makes such a huge difference and can really avoid really common pitfalls. Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's a relatively simple takeaway. If you think redundancies might happen, you want to start planning consultation as early as possible. What you should be watching out for next, as I said, lots of changes are taking place in 2026, 2027. And as it's clear from the fact that we don't even really have all of the specific numbers that we need for all the knowledge around this is all part of a wider program of employment law reform. So further developments are expected over the next couple of years, including more detail on the organisation-wide consultation threshold that I mentioned. And we're probably looking at even more rules around fire and rehire, the dismissal and re-engagement. So this is not a one-off change, it's part of an evolving landscape, and staying up to date will be really key. Now, what I think we're likely to see is much more litigation in short term. The rules are going to be tested. We're going to get more cases and more case law, which will be helpful in a way because it will clarify quite a few of the rules. I think we'll get much clearer guidance, especially on aggregation. But I think there's a real potential for expansion of employee protections over the next few years. So it is an area to keep under review, certainly. So rounding off with some key takeaways. So from next Monday, the 6th of April, financial penalties for failing to consult will double. Tribunals will have greater powers to increase awards, and the scope of collective consultation is going to be expanding. Overall, the expectation on employees to follow proper processes is increasing, and that is the main takeaway, really. Getting the process right is more important than ever. And if you don't get it right, you could be on the hook for a serious amount of money. So thank you for listening. As I said, I hope you're still all as engaged as can be. I will, no, what will I do? I will go back to the meeting window and see if there are any questions. We have a question from Sarah, which came in quite early.
I'll just read them out
Oh,
to you, Zanthe.
oh,
Sorry,
thanks,
just
Dawn.
jumping in.
I was just
Yeah, so we've got two from Sarah. So it's not specifically regarding redundancy, the first one, but should we be communicating or notifying staff of the Employment Rights Bill changes rather than just listing those that have been updated and and tell them that handbook has been updated? Legally, we should, I believe, rather than just best practice.
You're not really under an obligation to sort of sit your employees down and train them as to their rights, and your obligations as an employer. So you don't legally need to. As you say, it's best practice, I suppose. But genuinely, if you just say, the handbook has been updated, you can say pay close attention to the changes that have taken place on pages, whatnot, and then do it that way. I'd probably recommend that you do that. You can, of course, sit them down and send a comprehensive note out of everything that's changed and how their rights are changing, but it might be more practical to, like with the things with SSP, obviously just address them on the ground as they come up. So you don't need to legally sit them down and let them know that everything's changing, but it is best practice.
Okay, thank you. Sarah again. So fire and rehire. We've had a fixed term contract that was working 5 days per week. At the end of a fixed term contract, we could extend that only 2 days due to sales. We spoke to the employee and they were happy to accept. Is this okay?
I mean, that's edging on a specific query. I'd need to see the documentation really and have a good look. But fixed term contracts, and again, it depends on how long the employee was with you, how long the fixed term contract went on for, as to what kind of rights they acquired. So it's probably all right, but this is something that you should probably get a bit of specific legal advice on. Can't really give an answer if I haven't seen the documentation, if I haven't got a bit more detail.
Okay, thanks. Louise, what happens regarding penalties and tribunal if a limited company goes into liquidation?
Again, that's liquidation is a whole beast of itself. It totally depends on what your existing assets are at the end of the liquidation, or as the process going through with creditors and things. um so it depends. Again,
Okay.
that's that's a
Yeah,
big question. I think you
yeah.
should probably get some advice.
Jess Dennis. So, how much of this is relevant where there are under 20 employees impacted?
So the collective consultation rules don't trigger when less than 20 people are effectively at risk of being made redundant. So not an awful lot of it. But again, there are still risks, of course, with unfair dismissal and other awards that are affected when you make less than 20 people redundant. So whilst the collective consultation steps don't apply, there will be other risks, and it is something that you should still get legal advice on. We see this quite a lot where you know where redundancy processes increase or expand at an unexpected time, and then things do trigger all of a sudden, and then you find yourself in the process where collective consultation rights do apply.
Cool. And we've got Claire Donaldson. So, is the minimum trigger for consultation per total number of employees or number of redundancies? And do you have to consult with the whole organisation or just the teams affected?
So the minimum trigger for the consultation is for the total number of employees that are going to be made redundant, not the number of employees that you have in your company. No. um, some consultation requirements do relate to number of employees and companies, but no, that's it. And do you have to consult with the whole organization? No, you just need to consult generally with the people who are affected, so people who are at risk of redundancy. But again, the pool might be much wider than you think, because of pooling, which is a concept effectively whereby if someone is, you know, at risk of redundancy, you should pool them with others who could reasonably carry out their role. So that's something that comes up really frequently with clients of mine when we discuss redundancy, who is affected, and quite often the pool is larger than you think. But no, there's no need to pull in the whole organisation.
Okay, brilliant. I think that's all the questions taken care of, Zanthe. So I'd like to thank you for putting that together. It's really insightful and useful. And thank you everyone for attending today. We'll end the meeting now. If you've got any questions, please call us. If you're if you're not a client of Neathouse Partners, call us as well. And we'll catch you soon.
Sure. All right. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks all.
All right, no worries. Catch you,
Cheers.
guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.